Good evening and welcome this evening to the opening lecture, public lecture for the 2024 Prairie Symposium for the Common Good. It's so good to see you all here with us this evening. My name is Gertrude Rompré. I have the privilege of serving as the Director of Mission and Ministry here at St. Thomas More College, and I also have the privilege of serving as your MC this evening. In that role, it'll be my pleasure to call forward a few of our distinguished guests and our president, Dr. Carl Still, to bring greetings. So if I could turn it over to Dr. Still, please.
Well, thank you, Gertrude. Good evening to all of you and a very warm welcome to St. Thomas More College at the University of Saskatchewan. As we gather here in the Father O'Donnell Auditorium this evening, we acknowledge with respect and gratitude that we are on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis. All of us who live in Saskatchewan are treaty people. All of us who are members of St. Thomas More College have committed ourselves to seeking truth about our shared history with Indigenous peoples and pursuing reconciliation and partnership with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. May our walking together, especially over the next few days, lead us closer to the reconciliation we seek for ourselves, our institutions, and all the generations that follow us. May our wise and generous Creator bless that good intention. This has been a special day at STM and the beginning of rich opportunities for dialogue and fellowship over the next few days. We have a number of special guests with us this evening, including faculty, staff, and presidents of Catholic colleges and universities across the country. This morning, our college hosted a meeting of the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities in Canada, attended by 12 presidents and 5 bishops. And tonight's lecture is the first of 2 public events associated with the Prairie Symposium for the Common Good. This is the first time STM has hosted the Prairie Symposium, which is jointly sponsored by St. Paul's College at the University of Manitoba, Campion College at the University of Regina, and STM. So the Prairie Symposium encompasses 3 institutions in 2 prairie provinces, but by my count, there are representatives here from 7 different post-secondary institutions in 5 provinces, not to mention 2 distinguished scholars from the United States. So I thank them all for making the trip here to be with us. As we begin a conversation about diversities in our institutions, we have also invited 2 of STM's key partners in the work of higher education to join us this evening, Saskatchewan's Minister of Advanced Education and the Roman Catholic Bishop of Saskatoon. I greatly appreciate their presence and their support, and we are pleased that they have agreed to offer their own greetings to all of you as we gather in this province and this diocese. Thank you, and I wish all of you an excellent evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Still. We are, as Dr. Still just mentioned, grateful for the support that is present here, and particularly from the Ministry of Advanced Education. So we do have and do welcome the Honorable Gordon Wyant, the Minister of Advanced Education for the province of Saskatchewan, and also his Chief of Staff, Ms. Jill Stroder. So thank you for being here, and welcome, Minister Wyant.
Archbishop Bishop Hageman, Dr. Still, ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much, and thank you very, very much for the kind invitation to be with you tonight. I too would respectfully acknowledge that we're on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis, and I acknowledge that in the spirit of reconciliation, acknowledging that we are all treaty people. Well, as Minister of Advanced Education, I'm pleased to join you today on behalf of the Government of Saskatchewan. Let me begin by saying, and just taking a quick moment, to say that the Government of Saskatchewan recognizes, and I recognize personally, the profound impact that Leslie and Irene Dubé have had on the community and on St. Thomas More College over the last 20 years. And I was saddened, I think we were all very saddened to hear of Leslie's recent passing. And so on behalf of the Government of Saskatchewan, I wanted to extend Our condolences to his family and to his friends and to the St. Thomas More community. Les's devotion to service and generosity elevated the opportunities that are available to countless students and championed the value of community service learning. His legacy will live on and be honored by many people here at St. Thomas More College and across the community. This conference is a great opportunity for all its attendees. It's a chance to network with peers and friends from across the country and to foster dialogue on very, very important issues, and we'll hear a little bit more of that later on from our keynote speaker. The symposium features panel discussions with experts in education, health, social services, environment, among others. And I hope you have a chance to reflect on the value of working together toward a common goal, supporting students and their educational journeys. You and your colleagues make a tremendous difference to students through the Prairie Symposium of the Common Good. And I want to recognize the commitment of St. Thomas More College here at the University of Saskatchewan and Campion College at the University of Regina for the shared work of reconciliation with our Indigenous communities. And as Minister, I'm very, very grateful for your outstanding leadership. And I thank St. Paul's College at the University of Manitoba for being an equally important partner in the symposium over the years. These institutions have a history of approaching difficult issues such as diversity, homelessness, and housing insecurity with compassion and with dignity. It's important that faith-based institutions embrace their role of fostering dialogue and action to support our multi-faith communities. The hundreds of students who pass through your hallways each year are carrying important lessons with them because of your example. Your tireless efforts, largely behind the scenes, help post-secondary students attain their educational goals. The impact of this work is felt across each province and across the country through the students that you influence every day. So thank you for continuing to work together to help deepen connections between your institutions and far beyond. And I'm certainly looking forward to tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. Clark. I know she has a very, very important lesson for us this evening. So thank you very much for the opportunity to say a few words to you this evening.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wyant, Minister Wyant. Another key partner, of course, is our valued relationship with the Roman Catholic Diocese of Saskatoon. So I would like to now invite Most Reverend Mark Hageman, the Roman Catholic Bishop of Saskatoon, to also bring forth greetings. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gertrude, and ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, it's good to be here this evening, and I want to bring greetings also with my brother, Ukrainian Catholic bishop, who couldn't be with us tonight, the recently ordained Bishop Michael Smolinski. And I do want to acknowledge another brother bishop and strong colleague here in Saskatchewan, Archbishop Donald Bolin, the Archbishop of Regina. And appreciated very much the words of Dr. Still and His Honor Gordon Wyatt as I was reflecting on the welcome that I would give. And I do extend a hearty welcome. It's so good to be here and to talk about a very important issue, the theme, how all are needed in building the common good through dialogue and friendship. These sound like pipe dream words these days as we deal with polarization and anger and frustration in the public forum and beyond. And these are extremely important issues. They affect everything. As I was reflecting on the theme very briefly, I came across a quote from Pope Francis about politics. And this is not just an issue for provincial politicians. It's an issue for bishops. It's an issue for academic institutions, for all of us. Politicians today should be recognized by their ability to translate the great dream of fraternity into concrete actions of good politics that serve the common good at all levels, local, national, and international. As you know, Pope Francis has a real kind of tact for relating issues that don't seem to be related and making them relate and understanding them as such. He spoke also about the care of creation and environment a few years ago when he said the following about the expansion of the concern about common good. Everything is related, and the environmental question and care of creation is inseparable from the social question. Everything is related, and we need to be in relationship with all that God puts before us. But finally, the great experiment, maybe it's more than an experiment, it's a real objective for Pope Francis and for our church, is synodality. The Synod on Synodality, and we reflected on that today with the ACCUC presidents. I'll conclude with a quote from the Pope on this. Precisely at this time, when there is much talk and maybe little listening, and when the sense of the common good is in danger of weakening, the church and the world as a whole has embarked on a journey to rediscover the word together, common good. The journey of listening is in part why we're here tonight, and I thank very much Dr. Meghan Clark and the others who make this gathering possible to helping us in this symposium lean into an extremely important issue for our times, and that is how we are all called to share in the common good, and how this is not merely a consideration for good-minded people, but is a real objective for an institution like St. Thomas More and all higher education. Very good to be here tonight. Welcome to you all, and looking forward to your presentation, Doctor.
Thank you so much, Bishop Hageman. I appreciated the Honorable Minister Wyant reflecting on the role and the contribution of Leslie and Irene Dubé. So this evening's lecture, as we heard, is sponsored by the Leslie and Irene Dubé Chair in Catholic Studies. The Chair in Catholic Studies supports scholarship and research related to Catholic teaching and tradition, fosters Catholic education, and promotes ecumenical and multi-faith dialogue. This evening's speaker then, both in her scholarship and her service to the global Catholic community, well illustrates the ethos of the Dubé Chair in Catholic Studies. Dr. Meghan J. Clark is an associate professor of moral theology at St. John's University in New York. There, she engages students inside and outside the classroom on diverse topics in moral theology and Catholic social thought. She is a senior fellow of the Vincentian Center for Church and Society and serves as a faculty expert for the Holy See's mission to the United Nations. She has conducted field work on human rights and solidarity in Sudan, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Tanzania, and is the author of The Vision of Catholic Social Thought, The Virtue of Solidarity, and the Praxis of Human Rights, as well as the co-editor of Public Theology and the Global Common Good. Again, we can kind of see why we've chosen her as our guest speaker this evening. Very, very well versed in the teaching around the Catholic common good. Additionally, she is on the Faculty Advisory Board for the Catholic Relief Services, CRS University, for university engagement. And from 2010 to 2013, she served as the consultant to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Domestic Justice. She received her PhD in Theological Ethics from Boston College and her BA summa cum laude in cursu honorum in Philosophy and Theology from Fordham University. So please please join me in welcoming Dr. Clark to present to us this evening the topic, Everyone is Needed, Building the Common Good Through Dialogue and Friendship. Welcome, Dr. Clark.
some water now so that when I need water, I don't end up spilling or making a mess. Thank you all for being here. And thank you to Gertrude and Chris for the invitation. Is everyone able to hear me okay? I was sitting over there with the fans and I'm thinking, okay, I gotta make sure that I'm using sufficiently my teacher voice so that without with the mic it coming off as if I'm yelling at anybody. What I hope to do this evening is to paint a picture for all of you that looks at Catholic social teaching and its understanding of the common good within its broader vision. And so understanding in particular the way Pope Francis has tried to refocus our attention and draw out the way Catholic social teaching is rooted in the more fundamental virtues of faith, hope, and love. To say a little bit about the invitation in Fratelli Tutti about towards dialogue and friendship, but all through the lens of humility and the parable of the Good Samaritan. And then the way in which we're all invited to build what we see in Catholic social teaching as a community of belonging. And that's what we usually call solidarity when we have it in practice. Because Catholic social teaching has as its audience, both the church and all people of goodwill, it is not surprising that it has become really the cornerstone for conversations about mission in Catholic higher education, pretty much anywhere you go. It often provides the way in which we frame and understand inclusive mission and the way in which everybody is part of the mission of the institution and the student body, regardless of whether or not they themselves happen to be Catholic. And this works well across most institutions, if not all. However, in using the language of Catholic social teaching and talking about our principles as if they're kind of floating on their own, we sometimes miss the way in which it's more embedded in the Catholic tradition, but we also miss, I think, the fact that the common commitment that we share across traditions is actually deeper than we sometimes give it credit for. One of the things that I've learned through over the last 3 years, and in this last year in particular, I've been globalizing and making my theological ethics classes more multi-faith. I teach theological ethics of healthcare, theologies of peace, ethics, religion, and the common good, which centers around global development questions. And this semester, in my healthcare class, I had a religion and health curriculum grant from an organization called Interfaith America in order to really kind of embed diversity and kind of inclusive dialogue throughout the semester so that it's not just, and here's where we look at another tradition, but throughout the whole structure of the course. And what I have learned is from the way my students made deep connections in the convergence and divergences of not a feeling of compassion, but a deep and complicated ethics of compassion that is present in the ethical systems of not just Catholicism or Christianity, but also Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism. And so I want to start today with a frame provided by Pope Francis during the COVID pandemic. And this structure, the graphic is mine, but the content is the content from his Heal the World messages that came fairly early on in the pandemic, about thinking of Catholic social teaching as ultimately rooted in faith, hope, and love. And that faith, hope, and love are in fact unifying virtues, unifying values that are shared across different communities in a way that helps draw all people of goodwill into Catholic social teaching in an even deeper way. Faith, Pope Francis notes that it is only in the light of faith that we understand that God has created us in God's own image and likeness, made for love and for communion with Him and with one another and with all of creation. He used the same kind of framework in his joint statement on human fraternity with the Grand Imam in Dubai, which their joint statement began, quote, "Faith leads a believer to see in the other a brother or sister to be supported and loved. Through faith in God who has created the universe, creatures and all human beings, equal on account of his mercy, believers are called to express this human fraternity by safeguarding creation and the entire universe and supporting all persons, especially the poorest and those most in need," end quote. And that set the stage for this joint declaration on human fraternity that came out about 2 years before Fratelli Tutti. And so in this structure, human dignity and solidarity are Catholic social teachings principles that are ultimately rooted and tied to faith. Love, or charity, or caritas, is the common good and the option for the poor, which I will say more about in a little bit, but which help push us to focus on those most in need, beyond just the immediate question of an immediate need in front of us of what's necessary, but push us to find ways to walk with, to accompany, to build an inclusive community. Hope, which is crucial to motivate and get us to persist in what is difficult work, what often can be conflictual, in particular when we don't always see the fruits of the actions that we are engaged in the short term, when we are talking about reconciliation and building the common good and dismantling structures and systems of division and injustice. Those things don't come quickly. But interestingly enough, Pope Francis ties those to the universal destination of goods and subsidiarity, two principles that, at least for myself, I'd never thought of as being at all related to hope. And yet, if we focus on hope as a Filipina theologian, Dr. Agnes Brazal, we worked together on a project, and I'll say a little bit more about the project later, but I was part of a team of theologians from North America working on a project called Doing Theology from the Existential Peripheries. So kind of alongside the Synod, the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development convened teams of 6 theologians in each continent. And we were tasked, Dr. Darren Diaz at St. Michael's was the coordinator for the interviews that occurred in Canada. And I was assistant coordinator for the North American working group. And we were charged with going out to the margins, to the peripheries of the church and of society, and listening and collecting stories of people's faith and their journey with the church, where the church had journeyed with them, where it hadn't, what gave them hope, and reflecting on those interviews on hope and trust out of Asia. Dr. Brazal noted that the hope that she heard from those on the margins was not a denial of their objectively dire conditions, she said. Rather, quote, "Hope refuses to believe that all these would be the final word. They themselves have sown the seeds of hope in their lives by risking to work in another country, striving to get an education, joining Catholic support communities, and engaging in specific social advocacies. And so while it will be the smallest part of my presentation, I will nod to where does hope and this sense of the universal destination of goods or subsidiarity, which aren't usually what we think about when we think about hope, fit in. And finally, the Pope puts care for our common home under contemplation. And he does so arguing that when we contemplate, we discover in others and in nature something much greater than their usefulness. Contemplating goes beyond the usefulness of something. Contemplating the beautiful, said the Pope, does not mean exploiting it. Contemplating is free. We discover the intrinsic value of things given to them by God. And so while Sister Dawn tomorrow will talk more about the environment, this sense of seeing care for our common home as something like contemplation that is always needs to kind of be ubiquitous. It needs to be part of kind of the ether around any way we're conceiving of the common good, conceiving of dialogue, conceiving of building a different community. Because without that, right, we won't build a more inclusive community. We'll replicate what it is we've already done. And so what I hope I start with this vision because I think it roots, particularly for people of faith, and for institutions that are faith-based. It gives us a way of envisioning the way in which we are entering into dialogue, entering into the conversation that is not peripheral or on the side of what it is that we do or we believe, but actually just naturally flows out of what are our most core theological virtues, going back to the scriptures. So a little bit on human dignity before I turn to the common good. I don't think you can talk about the common good without beginning with human dignity. They always have to go together. If we're going to understand what it means to say that everyone is included, we have to start with who's that everyone? What does that mean? And human dignity in Catholic theology begins with the basic principle that human persons are created imago Dei, in the image and likeness of God, from Genesis 1:26 and 27. While this has been understood differently throughout history, the universality and uniqueness of the imago Dei, that is, of all persons created equally by God, in God's own image, has been consistently, albeit at times not equally, but consistently asserted. This is the sense of the kind of ontological dignity from the recent document from the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. And you can see that in the quote on the slide. Every person possesses an infinite dignity, inalienably grounded in his or her very being, which prevails in and beyond every circumstance, state, situation the person may ever encounter. At the same time, for Catholics, to be created imago Dei in some way must also be imago Trinitatis. This is something that is a part of the work that I've done elsewhere, that the social nature of the person is something that is constitutive and good about humanity. Thus, for Catholic social teaching, our humanity as in the image of God is not only a matter of creation, how we are created, but it also places a claim upon us. This claim goes far beyond simply not harming or not impeding others. Pope Paul VI in Popularum Progressio observed that there can be no progress towards the complete development of the human person without the simultaneous development of all humanity in a spirit of solidarity. In his philosophical writings long before he became John Paul II, then Karol Wojtyła explained, quote, "As human beings, we are capable of participation in the very humanity of other people. And because of this, every human being can become our neighbor. And that a human being finds fulfillment in his or herself by adding to the fulfillment of others." He does this in a book of essays called The Philosophy of Praxis, right? But this idea that we can participate in the very humanity of each other. Our human dignity is not just individual, it is communal. Dignity is something we possess, but it is also something we become, notes Dr. Anna Rowlands, who's a theologian in the UK. She's also the key theological advisor on one of the key theological advisors on the staff for the synod on synodality that is happening. She notes that dignity is something we can seriously debase in ourselves or for others, but it is not something we can fundamentally lose or completely alienate. End quote. This sense of human dignity as something that is already, but not yet, grounds Catholic social teaching's radical commitment to dignity as inviolable, while also recognizing that we live in a broken, sinful world in which people's dignity is often deeply and profoundly degraded and exploited. When we think about what does that mean, how is it that, right, I want us to think about human dignity as both a gift and a task. It is something we have, we are, but also something that we do. It helps set the stage for what it means to think about being human as something that is always relational. In Lumen Fide, Pope Francis explained human relationality, stating, "We come from others, we belong to others, our lives are enlarged by our encounter with others, even our own knowledge and self-awareness is relational. Self-knowledge is only possible when we share in a greater memory." That Lumen Fide 38, it is one of my favorite Pope Francis quotes, because it is this sense of drawing us in not only to those around us that we do know, but also the way in which that we understand our human dignity and our understanding and our participation in the common good as being not just about now, but tied to future generations and tied as well to the past, which for Catholics, anytime you can kind of reference and bring in the communion of saints, we do. And so it is a sense, how is human dignity a task? In Gaudium, it says, the Second Vatican Council says that our obligations of love and of justice and love are only fulfilled if each person contributing to the common good according to his or her own abilities and the needs of others are also met. This scope of the horizon helps us understand what we're talking about when we talk about the common good. The common good is, I've been in a number of meetings where people complain about the way that theologians talk about and define the common good. It is at once a principle and an elusive destination. It is dynamic and it is real, but it is also always aspirational. Right? We never get there and okay, now we have the common good and we're done. Right? Not in this life. Right? Catholic social teaching, it is a magisterial tradition. So, right, when we have definitions, we tend to go to the thing that is the biggest document, the biggest deal. So the definition that always gets used for the common good comes from Gaudium. It says it comes from Vatican II. The common good embraces the sum total of all those conditions of social life which enable individuals, families, and organizations to achieve complete and effective fulfillment. I've never stood in front of a classroom where someone's not looking at me, the look on their, what on earth is that? It is the most abstract framing you can kind of imagine. And yet, the common good provides the it's what we're seeking. It's the foundation for what we're trying to do. And this image, this graphic, this tree, it comes from the King County Office of Equity and Social Justice in Georgia in the United States. And it is my new favorite graphic, right? Because what does it, if we think about a tree, we get a sense of, right, a tree is never stagnant, right? It's always, it has its cycles, but it's always growing. It's always developing, provided that it is alive and it is flourishing. And you see what is involved in, if we are to flourish, if we are to build the common good: affordable and safe housing, access to parks and natural resources, quality education, access to health and human services, healthy built and natural environments, and it goes on. We get this sense of the dynamism, but also the deep structural nature that goes along with the common good, and that it extends and includes, and this is Pope Francis's one of his big contributions, that it extends Laudato Si extended our understanding of the common good to include both future generations and, as Lisa Cahill summarizes, the expansion of the universal common good beyond human societies to include other species, ecosystems, and the entire planet. It's part of why I like this image of the tree. And all of these things, you remove any of them, you remove any of the nutrients in the soil, anything that tree needs to flourish, and everything comes off kilter just a little bit. And our understanding of what that means for building communities is that everyone is involved. Everyone is needed. And so you have, right, the common good is of each person, of every person, of the whole person, excluding no one. There are no disposable people. There are no disposable communities. About 20 years ago, my mentor, David Hollenbach, identified and put out 3 strategic priorities for the common good that needed to shift our mindset if we were to try and build the common good together. Right. And they are, unfortunately, no less provocative now than they were 20 years ago. The needs of the poor take priority over the wants of the rich. The freedom of the dominated takes priority over the liberty of the powerful. And the participation of the marginalized takes priority over the preservation of an order that excludes them. Recently, in an article, I proposed adding a 4th. Sustaining creation and biodiversity takes priority over preserving established patterns of economic development. These aren't policy suggestions, they aren't political proposals, but they are normative and methodological claims that direct us to focus on a core requirement of building up the common good. And that is the option for the poor and vulnerable. That everyone really does mean everyone. And it recognizes that, as I said, the common good is always something we're working towards. We do not live in a world where perfection is possible. We live in a world where sin is real, where we are limited and finite, and it is a world that is in many ways broken. And I've been really kind of noticed how powerful the attentiveness at everything that I've been to since I arrived here in Saskatoon, to recognizing how reconciliation, how mending the brokenness is something that is ongoing and is something you have to actively seek to do over and over and over again. It becomes a habit. When we think about building the common good, the option for the poor is a key component. But it's, again, I want to propose that you think about the option for the poor in terms of positionality. Where are you standing? Where are we standing? It helps to ask ourselves, are we standing in the right place? The primary questions for the common good and the option for the poor aren't, is this the right answer? It's, are we standing in the right place? It's asking who's in the room and who's missing. I take the kind of the framing question from Father Greg Boyle of Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles, who emphasizes that our primary concern isn't getting the perfect program, but are we standing alongside the excluded and viewing from their perspective what needs to be done? And this is part of what the overall approach of Catholic social teaching is. We since the 60s, it's been labeled see, judge, act. The first question is, are we standing in the right place? Are we in the right position in order to see what we need to see in order to build an inclusive common good, an authentic common good? I mentioned the Dicastery Project, and one of the really powerful stories that was shared with me was when I was in El Paso, Texas. And I interviewed Carlos. Carlos is a farm worker organizer. So he spent the last 20 years working with migrants. And he explained how most of that time he didn't actually see that as tied to his faith, right? This was out of his commitment to justice, and it was his job. He was a community organizer. He's the director of a worker center. But that through engagement with the ministry of Pope Francis, he began to understand how it was tied to something much more deeper than he had realized in terms of his own life. And he said, now I see that it is nothing more than following in the steps of Jesus, that it is just being Catholic for me. In the interview, he talked about what it is that he had learned in thinking about his work and Pope Francis. And he said, what migration represents today is an act of resistance of people who refuse to disappear, refuse to be what Pope Francis called the disposable created by this system. And that's his explanation, his words. How often do we only see the needs of people rather than the agency and the dignity in what it is, right, in their standing up for themselves, and not simply the need for food, the need for shelter, the need for housing, for water and the like. Building the common good requires starting with the premise that everyone belongs, everyone has something to contribute, no one is expendable. And that's what we get when we think, and this push from the Holy Father to go out to the margins, to envision the church as a field hospital, this sense of everyone being invited to participate or be heard in their local communities for the synod. I'm not going to spend much time on it, but I want to pitch that even the universal destination of goods and subsidiary, even this vision of hope that we saw in that first slide applies to Catholic education. And that is when we think about what it means for the goods of all, the goods of the world to be created for all, when we think about John Paul II's image and vision of the social mortgage on property, we tend to think about stuff, but that's also knowledge and technology. That's so much more than just what we traditionally think about as property or as decision making. So when we think about the hope and the role that Catholic higher education has in building the common good, that also applies and is a way of really living out all aspects of Catholic social teaching, including the universal destination of goods and subsidiarity. But now I want to turn to Fratelli Tutti and the parable of the Good Samaritan. In the interest of time, I have the text, I'm not going to read the parable, but I imagine that everyone in this room has, in some sense, the basic structure of it in their head. The parable of the Good Samaritan is probably the most famous of Jesus's parables, without question. All of my students know it, no matter their religious or lack of any religious background. Basically, everyone thinks they know it. Or at least they know what a Good Samaritan is. Right? It's the good guy, it's the person who helps. I myself was born in one of the countless Good Samaritan hospitals that exist everywhere. But what Pope Francis has done in Fratelli Tutti is take the parable of the Good Samaritan and remind us that we all don't know what it is we think we know. And this isn't a simple story about how to be a nice person. What he does is, in my opinion, genius, and reminds us that we should maybe pay a little bit more attention to that story that we often kind of tune out because I know what's coming next. And it tells us some important things about what it means to build the common good. And in its complexity, is designed to challenge us from just about every angle. The story itself is an excellent dramatization of the see, judge, act method. And I ask healthcare students all the time, so why does he pour oil and wine on the guy's wounds? Wine to disinfect, oil to coat the wound, right? So we can tell that he had an open wound that was bleeding. Otherwise, right, if he's just got a broken bone, nobody's wasting valuable resources. Wine and oil would have been expensive. And everything we see in this story is that this isn't some wealthy person who stops to help the guy on the side of the road. It's attentive to the concrete, practical, real, specific needs of the person in front of him. It attends to the ongoing need in setting up a long-term plan, taking the wounded man to an inn, paying the innkeeper, assuring him he'll stop by to check again to see if he has left him enough money to care for him. It's a relationship, not a one-off. He doesn't stabilize him and, okay, I'm good. Now it's someone else's problem. At the same time, Pope Francis does something unique in centering the parable of the Good Samaritan because it's not usually the central biblical story that Catholic social teaching uses. Usually, we use the Beatitudes or Matthew 25's parable of the Last Judgment. For I was hungry and you fed me. I was in prison and you did not visit me, right? We know those images and we see them. They're often on posters and invoked all the time. And they're important, centered stories for Catholic moral theology, but they're all kind of one-dimensional. When I'm thinking about the Beatitudes or I'm thinking about Matthew 25, I am always the person in the position to, did I help or not? Am I being a peacemaker or not? It's always one directional in a way that the parable of the Good Samaritan is not. It is fluid and challenging. It challenges us to recognize that at different points in our lives, every single one of us, without exception, will be everyone in that story. He notes from the outset there are many ways to pass by at a safe distance in which the needs and the vulnerability of the neighbor do not touch us. And at some point in our lives, we are like the religious elites who see our neighbor in need and just keep walking. And often with kind of an air of being absolutely certain that we know what God wants and asks for, right, as we walk by someone in need. And that's not always, right, the obvious of actually walking by. But there are many ways in which, as Francis says in Fratelli Tutti, you can see on the slide, we're called to acknowledge that we are constantly tempted to ignore others, especially the weak. And he goes on to say, this also tells us that belief in God and worship of God are not enough to ensure we are actually living in a manner pleasing to God. The parable of the Good Samaritan is presented as offering the antidote to many intersecting social ills of inequality and exclusion. And a glance at the chapter's endnotes in Fratelli Tutti, it's chapter 2, reveal a complex web of citations weaving together biblical references alongside insights of his predecessors, the early church fathers, and a wide range of Francis's own pastoral messages. Ultimately, it is the personal element that Francis often emphasizes by targeting his words and actions and trying to get us to trying to hold up a mirror to the ways in which we do or don't live out this complexity in our own lives. If I am honest, I have to face the fact that it isn't just between those who keep walking and the Samaritan who stops. Positionality is not fixed. And at some point in my life, I will be the wounded man in the ditch, in need of help. And as the Jewish New Testament scholar A.J. Levine challenges, if we pay attention to the first century context, we then have to ask ourselves, when I am the wounded man in the ditch, am I prepared to accept help from someone I consider my enemy? Not just someone I don't like, not just someone who gets excluded, but someone I perceive as a threat, as my enemy. And at some point in my life, I will be like the robbers on the road, the one who is responsible or complicit in the pain and woundedness of others. And I pray more often than not that when I see a neighbor in need, I will be like the Samaritan, who not only stops, but who listens to be able to notice and see and judge what the action needs to be. When we think of the parable in this way, we also begin to recognize that everyone, even those on the margins of society or power, they too are everyone in the story. They are not just the wounded man in the ditch. They too can be the Samaritan who stops, the person who in other ways is responsible for the woundedness of others, or the ones who are callous to the needs of someone else they see in the community. This is part of what the option for the poor and as central to the common good helps us to recognize. That they too are partners for dialogue and friendship. They too are all of the people within the parable of the Good Samaritan. And so humility and community emerge as crucial for thinking about what it means to build up the common good. And so just a little bit on dialogue and friendship, trying to be attentive to time. in that joint statement on fraternity with the Grand Imam of Dubai, the two faith leaders called for greater attention to dialogue. The document defined dialogue as, quote, dialogue, understanding, and the widespread promotion of a culture of tolerance, acceptance of others, and of living together peacefully would contribute significantly to reducing many economic, social, political, and environmental problems that weigh so heavily on a large part of humanity. Dialogue among believers coming together in the vast space of spiritual, human, and shared social values, and from here transmitting the highest moral virtues that religions aim for. It also means avoiding unproductive discussions. Now, it's interesting to think about what it means to call for dialogue, but also recognize that that's not every conversation is one that will be productive or can or should be entered into at a particular time. I'm currently on the dialogue team for the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity's informal conversations between the Salvation Army and the Roman Catholic Church. And it's been a fascinating and an interesting experience, because one of the things that I have learned is just how much, when Pope Francis says, I cannot truly encounter another unless I stand on firm foundations, for it is on the basis of these I can accept the gift the other brings and in turn offer the authentic gift of my own. And that's the quote on the slide from paragraph 143. I can't, and I've learned so much in trying to articulate a Catholic understanding of justice and development, justice and mercy, for how it is to have a conversation with another tradition where we're not aiming at, right, we're not trying to understand and get to an agreed upon definition of justification the way that occurred in the Lutheran Catholic dialogues, or where you're trying to kind of get to agreeing on how we do or don't understand faith commitments. We're very, very different churches, very, very different faith communities. And yet, if you look around the world in the situations of immediate disaster, conflict, typhoons and drought and all of usually the first two groups on the ground are the Catholics and the Salvation Army. So what does it mean to talk about a dialogue, to talk about Christian unity, right, in that context? Our conversations are about deep listening and mutual respect. The purpose isn't about changing someone else's mind or winning a debate. It's about developing a relationship in which, as we have institutional conversations, there also can be more local conversations. And if we can listen and learn and collaborate better on the ground, if we can do that kind of dialogue, then the fruit of it is a form of Christian unity. And you could, right, that could be where it was with a different tradition or a different community that isn't Christian, and we still would be talking about dialogue that can lead to greater unity, greater building up of the common good. One of the things I appreciate about Pope Francis is he's emphasized that dialogue should not fear disagreement or conflict. But if it is to be fruitful, it must be open, inclusive, and honest. This is a particular challenge in the age of social media. Dialogue, the Pope notes, calls for perseverance. It entails moments of silence and suffering, yet it can patiently embrace the broader experience of individuals and of peoples, he says. And yet when we think about, I still refuse to call it anything other than Twitter, when we think about the flood of information, the flood of, right, what scrolls and kind of hits you, just, it feels, the image of flood seems accurate, right? It comes at you, almost refreshing without you even, right, trying to refresh it, right? I want to click that, but then suddenly it's gone and I can't find it again. Where does wisdom fit in? It's obfuscated and lost. The ability to discern truth and verify information gets harder and harder. And those of us who are in classrooms see this at all stages, from grade school through higher education. Teaching students how to evaluate and verify information gets harder and harder in an age of artificial intelligence and deepfakes. And this is one aspect of why the Vatican is so concerned about artificial intelligence. Because AI and social media often work against building communities of dialogue that seek wisdom and mutual trust, that can go across divisions. And if we can't do that, if we can't engage where we can, right, be sure about not just goodwill, but verified information, that we are starting with the same basic set of rational dialogue, then it becomes really hard to learn from each other's experiences, because at a certain point, we're not even speaking the same language anymore. A counter to that, something that buffers against that, according to Catholic social teaching, is intergenerational dialogue and intergenerational communities. It's why the Pope always is often speaking about the importance of grandparents, right? Which, as someone who grew up, I've been telling people about how, and I used to come to Canada, it was to Stratford, to the Shakespeare Festival with my grandparents every summer when I was in high school. Intergenerational communities are an important element of Catholic social teaching's understanding of dialogue and the common good. That part of this everyone is needed is this bigger sense of time and space that includes a memory that isn't just mine and isn't just right now, but it is also a process. If we take a hard look internally, this isn't something that the Catholic Church has always done, practiced very well. We struggle with the kind of dialogue that Catholic social teaching calls for. And that is why the Synod on Synodality that's happening right now is so important and gives so many of us, myself included, immense hope. Because it's not about what does or doesn't come out in terms of statements or positions. It's about the process. It's about, for the first time ever, you have a synod where lay people and women are sitting around a circular table with bishops and cardinals discussing the state of their understanding of the gospel, of what it means to live discipleship with those lay people and women as full voting members of the synod. The process is significant because it's modeling for us what an inclusive dialogue can look like, including the frustrations that it's not moving fast enough, and it's, right, is there going to be real change? It's really about, right, dialogue and building up the common good is about how we do it, as much as it is about the aspirational endpoint that we're aiming at. And it is because of that that we acknowledge dialogue is complicated, that truth and human rights matter, that pluralism is a good. It's not this thing that we just happen, right, that we can't get out of because we just do live in diverse communities. That diversity is a good thing. that pluralism enriches our dialogues, it enriches our conversations. In practice, I've done some field work in East Africa, and I really struggled. I wanted to tell a story, like I wanted to lift up a story, and I tried to find one that didn't start out with a horribly depressing social reality. I'm an ethicist. I kind of exist in order to kind of bring everybody's mood down and kind of point to hope in ways that you're like, seriously, that's where you're going. And so I share this as well with one of the communities in question in the last 2 years, is in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, has been marred by conflict such that I haven't been able to have more than one-off email from the sister I worked with up in the north. But in Ethiopia, Catholics are not the majority. They're a small minority community. The majority of the population are Ethiopian Orthodox. And so you have Ethiopian Orthodox, you have a Muslim community, and you have the Roman Catholics. In practice, and this isn't just in Ethiopia, but in many countries where Catholics are a minority, they are not a minority in terms of the social development and aid to the poor kind of sector, the social welfare sector of society. They still are a major component of many social welfare sectors in countries where we are not the majority religion. This would be true if you looked at India in terms of healthcare and education for the poor as well. So when I spent some time with the Daughters of Charity in Ethiopia in 2018, in Addis Ababa, the capital, and up in Mekelle in Tigray, one of the things that was interesting was in all of the communities I went to, the sisters have what is called a DREAM program, which is it's largely funded by PEPFAR. It is an HIV/AIDS program that people get their antiretrovirals, they get HIV testing. But in all of these situations, these have also morphed into, it starts as the DREAM program, that's kind of the linchpin program, but it's a fairly extensive health clinic, in whether it's in Addis or in where I was in Nairobi or in Tanzania. And what's interesting is, particularly in Addis, was how many Muslim and Orthodox persons, especially those who were poor, would come, even if there was a clinic closer to where they were, they would come to the Daughters of Charity. And they would come to the Daughters of Charity because there they would be treated with dignity. There they could answer honestly, they could engage and seek what it is they needed, and they would be given opportunities in order to build out skills and health education beyond. But they knew that they felt safe to come for HIV testing, to get their medication, to follow up on other things that might be bothering them, because they knew they would be treated with dignity and treated as a member of the community, even though they weren't technically part of the local Catholic community there. Similarly, on the outskirts of the city, almost as if you were going up into the mountains, there the sisters were trusted with running a school for a community largely ostracized and poor. The Daughters of Charity have an impact on the common good, on building up an inclusive community that goes far beyond their numbers because of the way in which they engage and embody dialogue and friendship in the way that they minister to the needs of others. And this is why Pope Francis says that opening our hearts to others is healthy for us. The womanist theologian Emil Towns argues that if love is to have any enduring meaning, it requires an ethical community. Quote, ethical practice does not occur in human isolation or in an individual decision alone. It arises within a community and directly by the commitment of the person, end quote. Friendship, I would contend, is essential if we are truly to build the common good, or more of the common good tomorrow than existed today or yesterday. The already but not yet of the Catholic vision of the common good is born out in the process of friendship. Going back into the Christian tradition and Thomas Aquinas, theologian Steve Pope argues that friendship radically expands one's sense of what counts as one's own good and one takes as a worthwhile activity. He argued that for Aquinas didn't confine friendship to just a small circle of like-minded people. Quite the opposite, that the Christian tradition gives us a vision of friendship that transforms persons and communities and seeks to go out. It's an element that I was really excited to see in Fratelli Tutti because it hasn't received enough attention within Catholic social teaching. One of my biggest frustrations with what is otherwise a beautiful meditation on God and love, Deus Caritas Est, the first half of it, is this beautiful meditation on agape and eros, and philia is just not mentioned at all. But if we take seriously and we think through what reconciliation means, what building up the common good means, what the love of God and neighbor that to which we are called means. My favorite image of caritas, or this kind of image of love of God and love of neighbor in Thomas Aquinas, is that ultimately it's aiming as friendship with God through friendship with neighbor. This focus on social friendship tries us to see that a different kind of community is possible. And I don't know if this movie is popular here in Canada, but my least favorite movie line ever comes from the movie Love Story. And it's, love means never having to say you're sorry. It is the stupidest, most ridiculous statement. And it gets thrown around in American pop culture. And I'm not the generation that was watching that when it came out in the movie theaters. And still, I heard classmates reference it. I hear students today reference it. That isn't friendship. That isn't Christian love. Christian love that is the foundation for reconciliation includes and sets as necessary telling the truth, apologizing, forgiveness, truth and memory require that, yes, love means having to say, you're sorry. And social friendship is a helpful frame because it helps us push against this sense as if we cannot persist and have reconciliation while acknowledging what it is that has happened. Right? If we think about how and what it is that leads to reconciliation among our friends, it's a good model for then thinking, how do we then build that out? And that's part of what Catholic social teaching is trying to get at when it pulls together human dignity and the common good and points and why the Pope tries to frame fraternity as a kind of social friendship that is personal and not just kind of the abstract French Revolution fraternité that's universal. What you get here, friendship in Catholic social teaching, isn't abstract, it's deeply personal. So how do we think of a common good, building a common good that, yes, includes everyone, but is personal in how that happens and how we do that? If we actually pulled that off, if we built a more inclusive community through dialogue and friendship, what we would have as a result is solidarity. We would have incarnated a community of belonging. What we would have is the vision of Pentecost, in which unity in diversity is that which we seek, not uniformity, not everybody agreeing to the same thing. What we have is understanding, and they all understood in their own language, despite the fact that the people speaking were all Galileans. A solidarity that, as John Paul II defined, would be a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good of all and to recognize that we are all really responsible for all. But it is, as Sean Copeland notes, a wrenching task. It is not easy to try and embody the kind of conversations and dialogue that we are going to embark on over the next 2 days, and that many of you have tried to embark on and been practicing in your institutions as you share your case studies. But it is the task that not only Catholic social teaching, but more broadly, Christian discipleship itself, that the image of the gospel, the image of Pentecost, asks us to take up this task, to build the common good, to recognize that everyone is needed, and that a community of belonging is, in fact, possible. Thank you. So I don't know how we are on time. I am happy to take questions or comments. We have some time for discussion. I threw a lot at you, and I'm from New York, so hopefully I was not talking too fast. Go on.
Okay, hi. I'm Dawn Nowhere. Anyway, thank you for the presentation. I found it very interesting. This is just maybe giving you an opportunity to say a little bit more. How do you see within friendship, particularly? I always think of that as a mutual relation, and that there's different kinds of degrees in that. We talk about Trinity as mutual relations, and then we can talk about any other kind. I guess what I would wonder about, and I just want to hear what you might say, is I think that word, for me at least, captures more of the unevenness in terms of capacity. Even though both sides would have of any relation, or all sides of any relation, if it's multiple, some kind of entry point into a relationship, but it's very uneven most of the time. And I guess in terms of thinking qualitative goodness, or capacity, how do you see that? Is that part of friendship? Is it distinct from friendship? Just talk a little bit more to me about that, if you would.
I think when we think about relationship, right, even when we are thinking about and talking about mutual relationships, friendships where you have kind of this mutuality of and friendship of equals on other levels, not just kind of our humanity. And this is why the philosopher Aristotle didn't think you could have very many friends in life, because he thought you could only be friends with people who were of the same status, the same education level, right, where you could have kind of what he envisioned as a friendship of equals. And I would say that, there is in a way that is a type of friendship, but I don't even think that actually ever really exists in the way that the question is, what is possible in a relationship? So if we are talking about two people or two communities that have radically different levels of power, right? What does it mean to talk about social friendship between the United States of America and just about anybody else? When we're talking about a negotiation, right? Certainly any country in the global south. I've sat and watched negotiations at the United Nations in which in order to kind of be able to negotiate as equals, almost the entire global south is speaking together with one voice through the representative what's called the G77. To play on the G7, there are way more than 77 countries in it, right? In order to try and balance out the power of going up against and speaking versus the representative from the United States and the representative from the European Union in particular. And sometimes it's not the US, sometimes it's, and now I can't remember the acronym, but it's the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, right? They sometimes speak as a group, the four of them. And so, right, you're not talking about, so kind of friendship in terms of politics in that kind of sense. I think you are talking about a kind of an analogy more than what we recognize. But I don't think that's, I think that's just because of the current kind of the established structures we already have. I think in reality, when you're talking about, say, a teacher and a student, right? We don't have equal power. It's not a relationship of equals. But I don't think that it can't be friendship. I think depending on the situation. And so whether or not kind of over time it can be a relationship of friendship, I think has to do with whether or not the one in power with power is actually open to being changed by the other person. Right? And recognizing what it is that the other person can do. So if you think about in terms of education, right? How often are we convinced we know what is best for our students? We know what they need to learn. We know what questions they should be asking. We know what questions they should be researching. I gave 2 graduate students the advice yesterday of, as you look for a doctoral advisor, as you go into doctoral work, right? Select, you want a mentor that helps you clarify your own, right, the ideas that you're trying to develop and does not tell you what it is you should be looking at, right? That is there, is that there, right? And I think, so I don't think friendship is always the relationship we're talking about in a particular time, but I do think among communities in radically different situations, you can choose to be communities of friendship. But that is always going to mean giving up control and power on behalf of those who have more power than others. But it's also recognizing the agency and the capability and the resilience of people who who also are in situations where they have very, very little. Right? So it's not only seeing the deprivation, not only seeing the brokenness, but also seeing the way in which, right, the act of migration itself is an assertion of my dignity and of resistance and that I am capable, right? And not just the horrors I am fleeing and the kind of the deprivation into which I've come. So I think, but like solidarity itself, if I can't be changed by encountering you, then it's not friendship, it's not solidarity, it's not dialogue. We're just 2 people in a room. Yeah.
Thank you, Megan. I really liked the quote you had from the love story and how it frustrated you. It's one of the most frustrating things I've ever heard in this room was, I won't say who, but there was a lecturer who was here and said that solidarity is too weak a bond to be meaningful.
Too weak a bond to be meaningful?
Bond to be meaningful. And I'm wondering if you wanted to respond to that from the way that you've interfaced or brought into dialogue solidarity and friendship,
Mhm.
I think is a really good antidote to that frustrating statement.
I don't know the speaker, but I mean, I would venture to say that their understanding of solidarity is what's too weak a concept. I think I agree with Sean Copeland, right? It's a wrenching task. It's a difficult task. But I think if it proves too weak a bond, then what it wasn't solidarity in the first place, right? It may have been you had this common cause, but it wasn't solidarity. And I think, and this is because, and this is something I've worked on elsewhere, if we don't have that kind of on a human level, the openness and the vulnerability to encountering and being changed by the other, to recognizing that I may have to do and be and act differently because of being in this relationship with you, then whatever it is, it can't be solidarity. And that's, I think, part of the firm and persevering commitment, that it has to be rooted. But I think it really has to be rooted in this sense that we may not be equals in a whole host of other ways, but we're equally human in this encounter. And so what that's meant for me as a scholar is it means that, that not just what I write about the communities that I have met and interviewed, but the very kind of what it is I look at next and what questions that I'm looking at has to be accountable to the women who have shared their stories with me. And that means that I have to be different than the way we train scholars to do scholarship, right? It's what do I find, right? What I'm investigating, what I think is interesting, this kind of love of knowledge and pursuing the question, right? Kind of really doing what Fratelli Tutti asks, doing what synodality asks, means that theologians have to not control the questions that get asked. And that's hard for people, right? And so that's the kind of, that's part of what I think is different about solidarity than as a concept within Catholic social teaching than other kind of bonds that you can have. I think that there is some truth to kind of on a bigger scale, right? Solidarity may be what we get when you're kind of building a movement. And so on smaller scales, you have kind of friendship. And that what does that mean when we're trying to talk about across great distances? Can you be in solidarity with people that you've never met? I think sometimes that can be easier to think about than, because friendship's not really possible across kind of that kind of distance in which you don't really know a person. But I think we're seeing now, in my opinion, many of the college students in the United States are very clearly, they've learned something about empathy and what it means to really be moved by seeing somebody's suffering and somebody's story, and then feeling like you have to respond. You may not know the best way to respond. You may not have we should be limited in what we expect undergraduate students to on their own be doing and understanding. But I think there is something about the ability to be fully human in the face of another human being suffering that makes possible pretty much all of what Catholic social teaching holds out as what it means to encounter, and what Pope Francis says it means to encounter. There is a hand in the back too. Yes.
Yes, I have a quick question. Well, maybe it won't be quick. So
I promise to try and be quick.
Yes. So in your presentation, you talked about how Imago Dei kind of founds or lays a foundation for human dignity. And another place where dignity is discussed is in the language of human rights, etc. Could you draw a relationship between Imago Dei and human rights? Are there continuities or discontinuities between how we think about what human rights affords versus what Imago Dei affords? And are there opportunities for imagining or fostering solidarity by using the language of human rights as a way of finding solidarity across diversities?
That's what my book is on. Anybody's interested in a really long answer. That's my book looked at. So if solidarity is a virtue, to be understood as a virtue, which is what John Paul II called it in Solicitudo Rei Socialis, then virtues have to be habituated. They have to be practiced. They have to have practices. It has to be something that you can acquire. Again, very like Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas. What does it mean to have virtue? And what my book argues is that one of the ways in which we practice solidarity, we habituate ourselves to be predisposed and acquire as kind of our default position to enter into relationships of solidarity, is by practicing respect for human rights. And sometimes that's something that seems easy, right? I just don't violate the human rights of other people. But it's actually really difficult when we think about all of the ways in which we participate in systems and structures that that do not respect the human rights of others. My students will tell you I regularly ruin shopping for them. The $2 shirt at H&M becomes really complicated when we think about what does it mean to practice respect for human rights. You certainly can't be excited about it, which was what I have had more than one student complain about. Come into class on a Monday morning that their shopping trip was ruined because they were not excited about the deals that they could get anymore. So it's more complicated than just what I actually, the people I meet and those actions. So one of the things that I will say about human rights, so the kind of rooting everything in the Imago Dei, in the image and likeness of God, is where Christianity is going to start for any understanding of what does it mean to be a human person and human dignity. And one of the things that's interesting and that I have done elsewhere is put Catholic social teaching and what is called capabilities. So the work of Amartya Sen, who is the Indian developmental economist, whose understanding of human capabilities radically changed the way the United Nations understood human development. And so they began to not just count economic GDP and they began to look at access to education and access to health, and issuing the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, began issuing a human development report. And since the year 2000, the approach has been out of Amartya Sen's work on capabilities. And so a lot of the scholarship I do is putting capabilities and Catholic social teaching in conversation, and kind of how can Catholic social teaching contribute to conversations on development that happen in places like the United Nations, and how can Catholic social teaching be informed by actual data that we get. And here's the thing, when you look at the data, and you look at what does actually lead to better human flourishing, lead to human development, our integrated approach is what works. Right? Seeing it as a holistic approach that includes the person and communities and health and well-being and education and all of those things is what leads to greater human development in other places. And as all the popes have said in the modern age, simply increasing the gross domestic product doesn't guarantee that people's lives, of the people's lives get better. So it's, I don't see them as at odds, right? So the image of God is how we answer the question, well, what does human dignity mean and how do we understand it? There are actually the sense of it being something that is inherent, but also a process, also kind of a condition, is also found within secular conversations of human rights in the founding documents and the treatments at the United Nations. But there is a sense in which I do think the philosopher Jacques Maritain, who was part of the UNESCO kind of conversations about writing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I do think there's something to be said for, he said, we surveyed the world, and they did. They surveyed intellectuals, religious leaders. UNESCO, before the drafting, had this massive gathering of information. And what he noted was the list of what people believed were rights, were what the rights of human beings were, what people and communities were entitled to, was pretty standard. There just was a lot of disagreement as to why. Right? So that image of God question, right? Even among our fellow monotheists, right? We don't understand it the same way that Islam understands it, the same way that Judaism understands it. But that's okay. I don't believe that that's a threat to human rights or to Catholic social teaching. I think we are out of time. Okay.
Hi. Is it on?
So Sammy, you'll be the last question.
Okay, thank you. As you were speaking, I was thinking of Jesus himself. I often do that. And with some biblical imagination, I think of Jesus as a crowd magnet.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he attracted people from all sorts of life. So he has the power of inclusion in him, in his presence. But I could imagine also that many in the crowds could not speak with him or have a chance to dialogue. Yet something shifted in their hearts. So my question is the transition from dialogue to encounter. If you can say something about it, because I found this transition, it's not talked much about it. I mean, both dialogue and encounter has the human interest involved. But I have a feeling encounter has something more mature than dialogue. You can disagree with me or whatever, but I'm just wondering if you can give me this sense of transition from the dialogue, from the communication verbally to an encounter that I think can bring a lot of healing too. Thanks.
I think and I do promise this will be a short answer. I think what encounter represents is a shift in a mode of being. So I think that listening is kind of a starting point, right? So you think of kind of see, judge, like the see part, the observe, the simple listening, right? Am I hearing what someone else is saying, right? I think that comes first. And then if we're actually engaging that person, right, or that issue or that community, we can talk about dialogue. But I think kind of building on both, but also can happen without dialogue itself. I think the culture of encounter, the kind of mode of being in the world as being one of encounter that I do think we see in the Gospels, and I think is what Pope Francis is calling for kind of discipleship and the way of being in the world to be, to create a culture of encounter, is a shift that shifts the very way in which our kind of starting attitude in which we go out into the world. And so do we go out into the world kind of closed off? Are we going about our day? Are we existing, kind of seeking protection, in a state of fear, in kind of a state of anxiety? And I don't mean the clinical kind. I mean in terms of as if I should be worried about what's coming, right? Or is it I'm open to who I right? The people that I meet. And so I think encounter is, again, to use the language of virtue, I think it's something that we cultivate that then kind of becomes a mode of being. And that's where I think we see in the stories that someone like the Samaritan woman, right, who has this small encounter and dialogue with Jesus at the well, and then goes off, right? And how many people then changed and shifted and sought out and believed because of her story. I think there's a way in which we can see her story as one of kind of embodying what does it mean to be changed by the gospel and to then be a person of encounter. Because the little we are told about her, right, is that she goes back and shares, and there is this sense in which, right, she's not just sharing the gospel, but I think we find in there kind of a mode of being a disciple that is built on encounter, if that. And that is my very short answer to your question. It is up to her.
So hello, I'm Chris Franco. I'm co-director with Gertrude of the Center for Faith, Reason, Peace, and Justice. That's part of the partnership that's hosting the conference. And I was asked to thank Meghan in a fulsome way, which is a little bit dangerous because there's a lot going on in her lecture. But I wanted to start by saying simply that you did a nice weaving, I thought. And then I'll just name a little bit of that weaving, and then I'll give a more traditional thank you. And so this is just kind of what I heard, and it's a reduction. It's a bit like the TikTok video after the movie, maybe. But I heard that pluralism is a good, and that we have to recognize that as kind of a little bit of a basis for engaging the complexity that Catholic social teaching is calling us towards when we enter into these cultures of dialogue and encounter. Pluralism then becomes the basis for works towards inclusive mission. This is something that's dialogue, this is something that's action, this is something that's standing with so that we can see. That requires a theology from the margins, and it requires us to enter into institutions and to be changed, right? Because what dialogue is something that changes you and changes you as institutions. That's a hard task, especially when we think of part of our mission as building up the common good, which, as you say, excludes no one. And I think no being, actually, when you were talking about sort of the universal common good, citing Lisa Soul-Cahill. There's a few more things but maybe just the one thing that I really appreciated was how you showed us about the Catholic social teaching as it relates to faith, love, and hope in particular, but also the contemplation in order to bring into that ecological dimension. And I liked how you said that I'm also trained as an ethicist, and I liked how you said that ethicists need to come back to hope. And we do. So we might ruin the t-shirt, but we offer you like a hopeful alternative to the t-shirt. And that's part of our responsibility. And that's not always something that's taken seriously in academia. And I remember having a huge argument with one of my professors about that responsibility to build up again. And I see you building up again. So into the more traditional thank you. On a personal level, you helped me to reconnect some neurons that were active in my own formation as a Christian ethicist, but also connected things in new ways that eluded both me and my teachers. So I really did learn something. The minister talked about a lesson. I think I learned lessons from you. You really gave us a great start on the level of insight for our conference, but also on the level of vocabulary. And I wanted you to really realize that Meghan was actually a little bit tricky here because she used terms in innovative and special ways that point back to the meaning and to the insights that she shared. So really this deep level on vocabulary. So I want to thank you for setting the tone for our conversation that will follow over the next 2 days. And I look forward to learning more from you, especially on the synthesis panel that Meghan's agreed to sit on at the end of the conference. So as a token of our appreciation, we have some STM swag here for you. And I just invite you one more time up, and maybe another round of applause for Meghan as she accepts.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for being here. Thank you for putting up with a very warm space, but I hope that it's translating to some very warm encounters that we would continue in the atrium. So please join us for a reception and an opportunity. I think we did miss a few questions. I'm sorry about that, but perhaps we can take the opportunity to continue the conversation down the hall and to the right. And if you would like to continue the opportunity of engaging with some new ideas, there is a second public lecture tomorrow evening. It's the IOT lecture on faith in the environment. We'll be hearing from Sister Dawn M. Notwer on sharing the Creator's earth, the meeting of St. Francis of Assisi and the Sultan al-Malik al-Kamil, as the model of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So please feel free to join us again tomorrow evening. Tomorrow we start at 7:30 p.m. in this same space. So again, have a good evening. Thanks for being with us, and please join us for some refreshments down the hall. Thanks.